He didn't just take my seat. He took my seat, made me move by blocking the entire aisle until I had no choice, and then turned to the line of passengers behind him and said out loud with a straight face, "Sorry, I had to wait for this lady to move out of my seat." His seat. The seat I had booked. The seat with my name on it. His. For the next 3.5 hours, I had the most urgent bladder in the history of commercial aviation. This story takes place in the early 2000s, on a flight that this man almost certainly still thinks about. Not because anything dramatic happened. No confrontations, no raised voices, no flight attendants involved. Just a window seat, a middle seat, and a woman who suddenly found she needed to stretch her legs approximately every 10 minutes for the entire duration of a cross-country flight. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and let me tell you about the most inconvenient seatmate this man ever had. If you traveled frequently in the early 2000s, you developed a system. Airlines weren't what they are now. No seat upgrade purchases, no premium economy, no color-coded boarding zones with their own entrance lanes. You got on a plane, you sat in your assigned seat, and the quality of the next several hours depended almost entirely on the luck of who ended up next to you. Frequent travelers learned quickly. The aisle seat is everything. Aisle means you control your own exits. Aisle means you don't have to climb over strangers when your knees lock up at hour 2. Aisle means you are a person with agency in a flying metal tube rather than a person trapped between a window and someone else's elbow. I always booked the aisle, without exception. It was the one small comfort in a process that had very few of them, and I protected it accordingly. So when I found my row, stowed my bag, and settled into my aisle seat with the specific satisfaction of a person who planned ahead, I was in a decent mood. The flight was full. The middle seat beside me was occupied by a large man, genuinely large, the kind of large where an airplane seat is a genuine hardship, who turned to me almost immediately. He explained that his company's travel department had made an error. He'd needed an aisle seat. He was a big guy, he said. It was just more comfortable. He was sure I understood. And somehow he'd ended up in the middle. He needed me to switch with him. Now, here is the thing. Had he asked me the way a normal human being asks another human being for a favor, I would have said yes, immediately, without hesitation. I could see he was uncomfortable. I understood the logistics. A large person in a middle seat for 3.5 hours is genuinely unpleasant, and I am not a person who takes pleasure in other people's unnecessary discomfort. Manners, that's all it would have taken. A please. A thank you, the basic social acknowledgement that he was asking me to give up something I had specifically arranged for my own comfort, and that my willingness to do so was a kindness, not an obligation. What I got instead was a statement, not a request. He needed the seat. He was blocking the aisle while he said it, not intentionally maybe, but the effect was the same. The line of boarding passengers behind him had stopped moving, everyone was waiting, and the social pressure of holding up an entire plane full of people had made my options very limited very quickly. I moved. Of course I moved. What else was I going to do? Cause a scene while 40 people stood in the aisle waiting to get to their seats. I picked up my things and moved to the middle seat, and then he turned around. He turned to face the line of passengers still boarding, the people who had been standing there watching this entire exchange, and he said, pleasantly and with complete confidence, "Sorry about that. I had to wait for this lady to move out of my seat." My seat. He looked at the crowd. Several people nodded sympathetically, the way you do when someone has just had a minor inconvenience resolved. Nobody had seen enough of what happened to push back on the framing. As far as the boarding passengers were concerned, they had just witnessed a woman slowly vacating a seat that belonged to the man who was now settling comfortably into it. I sat in the middle seat, and I thought about that sentence for a moment. My seat. Not the seat I needed. Not the aisle seat. His seat. The one with my name on the boarding pass. The one I had booked in advance specifically to avoid exactly the situation I was now sitting in. He hadn't just taken it. He'd rewritten what had just happened in front of witnesses before I'd even finished putting my seatbelt on. I looked out the window for a moment and considered my options. I had 3.5 hours. It wasn't really a plan exactly. It was more of a realization. I was in the middle seat. I had no control over the armrests, limited space, and a window I couldn't look out of without leaning past a stranger. These were facts I could not change for the duration of the flight. What I could change was how often the man in the aisle seat had to get up. Now, here's the thing about a large man in an aisle seat next to a middle seat. Getting up is not a casual operation. It's not a quick pivot and a step to the side. It is a production. Tray table up, seatbelt off, anything balanced on his lap relocated. The physical process of extracting himself from the seat and standing in the aisle to let the middle seat passenger out, and then reversing the entire sequence when the middle seat passenger returned. For a large person in a cramped airplane, this was a meaningful expenditure of effort every single time. I became very interested in the aisle. About 10 minutes into the flight, once we'd reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign went off, I turned to him politely and said I needed to get out. He got up. I got out. I walked a few rows back and stood in the aisle for a minute, then returned and waited for him to stand and let me back in. He settled back in, seatbelt on, tray down, shifted his weight, found his position. 10 minutes later, I needed to get out again. He got up, I got out, stood in the aisle, came back, he stood, let me in, resettled. Just as he'd gotten his drink from the flight attendant and arranged it on the tray table, I needed to get out. Just as he'd pulled out the food he'd brought from the terminal and started to open it, I needed to get out. Just as he'd closed his eyes and tilted his head back in the universal posture of a man attempting to sleep on a plane, I needed to get out. Every 10 minutes, give or take, for 3.5 hours. He got up each time. What else could he do? I wasn't doing anything wrong. Middle seat passengers have the right to use the aisle. Flight attendants were not going to intervene because a man had to stand up to let his neighbor out. The rules of basic airplane courtesy required him to get up, and he knew it, and he got up every single time. He never said a word to me directly, but I watched the energy change. The first few times it was mildly inconvenient. By the midpoint of the flight, it was visible on his face. That specific tightening around the eyes, that means a person has started to suspect that what is happening to them might not be entirely coincidental. By the final hour, he was getting up before I'd even fully turned toward him, with the resigned efficiency of a man who has accepted his circumstances. I was polite every single time. "Excuse me, I just need to get out for a minute." "Thanks, sorry." "Excuse me again." 3.5 hours. I got up approximately 20 times. I stood in the aisle, waited what felt like a reasonable amount of time, and came back. We landed without incident. He didn't say anything to me. I didn't say anything to him. We gathered our things and deplaned like two strangers who had sat next to each other on a routine flight and had nothing in particular to say to one another. Except that one of us had claimed a seat that wasn't his and lied about it to a row of witnesses, and then spent 3.5 hours getting up and sitting down in a flying metal tube while the woman he'd done it to stood in the aisle every 10 minutes for reasons she was not required to explain. He walked up the jetway in front of me. I never saw him again. I thought about him the whole drive home, and I smiled the entire way. Here's what I appreciate about this. Looking back from the distance of 25 years, there was no confrontation. There was no speech. There was no moment where I leaned over and said, "I know what you did, and this is why I keep getting up." The revenge was completely invisible. Officially, I was just a person who happened to need the aisle a lot. Unofficially, I was a person who had been lied about in front of strangers and had decided that the middle seat came with certain privileges that I intended to exercise fully. He could suspect. He probably did suspect by hour 2, but he couldn't prove it, and he couldn't say anything without acknowledging that he knew why it might be happening, which would require acknowledging what he'd done. He was trapped by his own lie. The aisle seat, it turned out, was mine either way. I want to be clear, if he'd just asked nicely, I would have moved and we both would have had a perfectly fine flight. That's the whole story, really. That's what it was always about. Not the seat, the please. Some people treat politeness like a weakness. Like asking nicely means you're admitting you need something from someone, and that's beneath them. What they don't realize is that politeness isn't weakness, it's armor. Without it, you're just a large man getting up every 10 minutes on a 3.5-hour flight. If this gave you that particular warm, petty glow that only airplane justice can provide, smash that like button and drop a comment. What's the rudest thing someone has ever done to you on a plane? And how did you handle it? I want every story. And if you want more tales of small injustices meeting perfectly proportionate consequences, subscribe. New story every week. Safe travels.